The hull groaned around me like something dying. 40 feet per minute through water so black it swallowed the submersible's running lights. 23,000 feet to go. The pressure gauge climbed steadily. Numbers that meant instant death if anything went wrong with the titanium shell keeping me alive. I'd done this descent maybe 300 times over 12 years. Still got that tightness in my chest watching the depth counter roll past the first mile down. Your brain knows the math. Knows what happens to human tissue when it meets that kind of pressure without protection. The intercom crackled. Kate Sharp's voice came through clear from the surface. "Jerome, you're looking good on descent, holding steady at 40 per minute." "Copy that, Kate. Systems nominal." I ran through the mission brief again while the submersible dropped through the darkness. Routine repair job. Fiber optic cable severed somewhere near the bottom of the Mariana Trench. 6-hour repair window if everything went according to plan. It never did, but 6 hours was the estimate. The cable carried internet traffic between Japan and the Philippines. Millions of people probably had no idea their emails and video calls traveled along a strand of glass thinner than human hair, lying on the deepest seafloor on Earth. When something cut through the protective housing and severed that connection, guys like me went down to splice it back together. Kate had mentioned something else during the briefing. Sonar readings showing something large circling the repair zone for the past 3 days. She'd dismissed it as equipment malfunction before I could ask questions. Made sense. Electronics failed constantly at depth. Water pressure did things to circuits that the engineers never quite figured out. I'd seen sonar screens show phantom contacts, depth gauges that read negative numbers, temperature sensors that claimed the water was boiling. You learn to trust your eyes and hands more than the instruments. The submersible shuddered slightly. Normal turbulence from thermal layers. I checked the ballast controls and kept descending. 12 years of this work had taught me to notice patterns. The way cable housings failed, how geological damage looked different from anchor strikes, which equipment malfunctions were actually malfunctions and which ones meant something else was happening. Most of the time, cable breaks were straightforward. Ships dragged anchors across the seafloor. Underwater landslides buried sections under tons of sediment. Metal fatigue from constant thermal expansion and contraction. Boring stuff that required technical skill, but no detective work. The intercom crackled again. Eugene's voice this time, the communications officer who logged every detail of these operations. "Jerome, passing 15,000 feet. How's visibility down there?" "Still black as the inside of a coffin. Floodlights aren't picking up anything yet." "Copy. Should have cable contact in about 2 miles. I adjusted the external camera angles and switched on the high-intensity floods. The lights carved a small bubble of visibility around the submersible, maybe 30 feet in any direction. Beyond that, nothing but the kind of darkness that made you understand why ancient sailors thought monsters lived in the deep ocean. The depth counter rolled past 16,000 feet. 17,000. At 18,000, I started scanning for the cable. These fiber optic lines ran in protective housing about the diameter of a garden hose. Steel mesh wrapped around layers of plastic and rubber, with the actual optical fibers nested inside like the world's most expensive spaghetti. Finding a broken cable on the seafloor was like looking for a specific piece of rope in a football stadium with all the lights turned off. 19,000 feet. 20,000. The submersible's sonar pinged constantly, painting a rough picture of the bottom terrain. Rocky outcroppings and sediment plains. Normal abyssal topography for this part of the Pacific. 21,000 feet. "Jerome, you should be getting close to the target area." "Yeah. I'm starting to see some debris on the bottom." Switching to active search pattern. I throttled back the descent rate and began a slow spiral pattern, following the submersible's computer-generated search grid. The floodlights swept across the seafloor, illuminating patches of gray sediment and occasional rock formations. 22,000 feet. Then I saw it. The cable housing emerged from the darkness like a black snake stretched across the bottom. I followed it with the camera, tracking the line toward what should have been the breakpoint. Contact on the cable. Following it to the damage site now. Copy, Jerome. Take your time and get us some good visuals. I maneuvered the submersible along the cable route, keeping the lights trained on the housing. Everything looked normal at first. Standard installation, properly weighted and secured to the seafloor anchors. Then I reached the first scratch marks. They appeared suddenly in the floodlight beam. Deep gouges running along the protective steel mesh. I stopped the submersible and adjusted the camera for a closer look. The scratches weren't random. They followed the length of the cable housing in parallel lines, each groove exactly the same depth and spacing. Too regular for geological damage. Too deliberate for anchor strikes or fishing gear. Kate, I'm seeing some unusual damage patterns on the cable housing. Getting video now. What kind of damage, Jerome? I moved the camera along the scratched section, documenting the marks. Deep gouges in the protective mesh. Very regular spacing. Looks almost intentional. Fishing nets can leave marks like that. Or trawling gear. Eugene's voice cut in, logging the observation as possible fishing gear entanglement. Jerome, can you continue to the actual break point? I followed the cable further. The scratch marks continued for maybe 50 feet, then stopped abruptly. The cable housing looked normal again beyond that point. But I'd worked cable repair for 12 years. I'd seen every kind of damage that fishing gear could inflict. Nets left tears and punctures. Trawling equipment dragged cables and bent them. Anchor chains left impact marks and crushing damage. I'd never seen anything that left marks like these. The gouges were too precise, too evenly spaced. They ran parallel to each other with mathematical precision, like someone had used the cable housing as a practice surface. Like something with multiple cutting implements had gripped the protective mesh and drawn those tools along the surface in perfect straight lines. Like something had been trying to write. The thought hit me before I could stop it. The scratch marks looked almost like language, like symbols carved into the steel mesh by something that understood pattern and meaning. I stared at the video feed, watching those parallel grooves disappear into the darkness beyond the floodlights. My hands were steady on the controls, but something cold was spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the water temperature outside the hull. Jerome, you still there? What's your status? Kate's voice snapped me back to the moment. I was floating at 23,000 feet in the deepest ocean trench on Earth, looking at cable damage that made no sense according to 12 years of experience. Yeah, I'm here. Still documenting the damage. Should reach the break point in a few minutes. But I kept thinking about those marks, about something massive circling the repair zone for 3 days, about the way the scratches looked less like equipment damage and more like communication, like something down here had been trying to tell us something. The scratches kept going, mile after mile of them carved into the cable housing as I dropped through the water column. 18,000 feet, 19, 20. Each 1,000-foot mark brought deeper gouges, more frequent damage. What started as surface scratches at 15,000 had become furrows you could stick your finger into. I adjusted the external lights, angling them down the cable's length. The beam caught another cluster of marks about 50 feet ahead. These ones looked fresh. No marine growth. No sediment buildup in the grooves. Recent. My hands found their rhythm on the controls without thinking about it. 12 years of this work and the movements became automatic. Trim ballast. Adjust descent rate. Monitor pressure readings. But my eyes stayed locked on those scratches. They weren't random. That's what bothered me most. Random damage from debris or equipment failure leaves chaotic patterns. Metal sheared in different directions, inconsistent depths, scattered impact points. These marks showed consistency, purpose. 20,000 feet. I brought the submersible closer to the cable, close enough that the hull almost brushed the titanium housing. The external cameras gave me a clear view of the damage through the monitor array. What I saw made my stomach drop. The cable shielding wasn't frayed, wasn't worn through from years of ocean current and pressure. It was torn apart, ripped open like someone had taken a crowbar to it, except no crowbar could generate this kind of force at depth. The titanium housing was built to withstand crushing pressure that would flatten a car in milliseconds. Whatever did this had strength that didn't exist in nature. Not in any nature I knew about. I maneuvered the external manipulator arm toward the damaged section. The hydraulic servos whined as the articulated joints extended, bringing the collection basket within range of the torn metal. Something glinted in the lights, fragments embedded in the housing material itself. Took me 3 tries to extract the first piece. The manipulator arm wasn't designed for precision work, more like using oven mitts to thread a needle. But I managed to work a shard loose and drop it into the sample container. The fragment was white, curved, sharp at one end, thick at the base. I collected 2 more pieces before transmitting the images to the surface team. Standard protocol. Document everything, get expert analysis before making field decisions. But part of me already knew what those fragments were, had known since I saw the first one catch the light. Surface, this is Deep 6, transmitting sample images for analysis. Copy Deep 6, images received. Stand by for analysis. Eugene's voice came through clear despite the distance. Amazing what they could do with fiber optic communication these days. Felt like talking to someone in the next room instead of 4 miles straight up. I waited, checked my air supply, monitored the ballast systems, adjusted position to maintain station keeping. All routine maintenance while my mind churned over what I'd found. The fragments looked biological, organic. But nothing that big should exist at this depth. The pressure alone would crush any living tissue. Deep 6, this is surface. Dr. Yang has preliminary results. Aubrey's voice replaced Eugene's. She sounded confused. That wasn't like her. 12 years in marine biology, she'd seen everything the ocean could produce. Jerome, I need you to verify these measurements. The fragments appear to be teeth, but that's not possible. They don't match any known species in our databases. The size alone. She paused. I heard papers rustling in the background. Each fragment measures nearly 8 inches in length. That would indicate a creature with a skull diameter of at least 15 feet. Nothing like that exists in the deep ocean ecosystem. 8 inches per tooth. I looked at the sample container, at the white fragments sitting in the collection basket. They seemed smaller in person, maybe because everything felt compressed in the cramped submersible cabin. But 8 inches. Jesus. Dr. Yang, are you certain about the identification? The dental structure is consistent with predatory species. Pointed crown, substantial root system for powerful jaw muscles. But Jerome... Another pause. This is outside my field of expertise. These measurements suggest something that shouldn't exist. I thanked her and closed the channel. Shouldn't exist. Right. Tell that to whatever had been chewing on our cable for the past 3 days. The implications settled into my mind as I continued the descent toward the severed section. Something down here was big enough to bite through titanium housing. Smart enough to target communication cables specifically. And territorial enough to keep coming back to the same location. 21,000 feet. 22. 23. The breakpoint appeared in my lights like a wound in the darkness. The cable simply ended, not frayed, not gradually severed by equipment failure or environmental stress, cut clean through in one massive bite. I brought the submersible to a complete stop and surveyed the area. The seafloor around the breakpoint told its own story. Sediment patterns showed disturbance in concentric circles, extending outward from the cable terminus. Something large had been moving through here repeatedly, circling the repair zone like a shark around chum. But sharks didn't grow to 15 feet of skull diameter. Sharks didn't bite through titanium. And sharks sure as hell didn't operate at crushing depths where the pressure would liquefy their organs in seconds. I counted 7 distinct circular patterns in the disturbed sediment. 7 separate visits. This wasn't random predation or territorial behavior. This was deliberate, systematic. Whatever was down here knew exactly what it was doing. I'd finished the preliminary cable assessment and moved the submersible into position for splice preparation. My fingers moved across the control panel with practiced precision, extending the manipulator arms, activating the cutting torch assembly, running diagnostics on the fiber optic repair kit. I positioned the primary manipulator arm above the worst section of damage. The hydraulic servos whined softly as the mechanical fingers extended toward the cable housing. Standard procedure called for cutting away the damaged section first, then splicing in replacement cable using the prefabricated connectors in my repair kit. Routine work. I'd done thousands of these repairs over 12 years of deep-sea operations. The external cameras swept automatically across their programmed arc, monitoring the work area for debris or unexpected obstacles. I glanced at the feeds occasionally, mostly just empty water beyond the reach of my floodlights. 23,000 feet of black ocean above me. Nothing moved at this depth except my submersible and the occasional deep-sea scavenger drawn by the lights. That's when the movement registered on camera 3. I stopped mid-motion, my hand frozen above the manipulator controls. Something had shifted at the very edge of the floodlight range. Not the lazy drift of marine snow or the scattered tumbling of bottom debris. This was purposeful, deliberate. I switched the camera to manual control and panned slowly across the darkness beyond my lights. The ocean floor stretched away in gentle undulations of sediment and scattered rock formations. Nothing, but the feeling remained. That certainness you develop after years of working in environments where your life depends on noticing things that don't belong. I increased the floodlight intensity to maximum and adjusted the camera angle again. The creature emerged from darkness like something torn from a nightmare and given form. My breath caught in my throat. The thing moving toward me defied every category I had for deep-sea life. 80 feet long at minimum, though I never saw the complete body in the lights. The head alone stretched 15 feet from snout to gill slits, broad and flattened like prehistoric shark species I'd seen in museum reconstructions. But where those ancient predators had been solid muscle and cartilage, this thing's flesh was translucent, pale as moonlight filtering through deep water. The bioluminescence hit me first. Cold blue light pulsed through the creature's skeletal system, like electricity flowing through circuit boards. I could see the bone structure clearly through the translucent skin. Massive vertebrae, elongated skull, the complex architecture of jaw mechanisms designed for crushing rather than cutting. The light patterns shifted and flowed along the creature's length, creating ripples of illumination that made the surrounding water shimmer. It moved with impossible grace for something so massive. No wasted motion, no unnecessary disturbance of the water around it. The tail swept in slow, powerful strokes that propelled it forward without the frantic energy I associated with large predators. This was controlled, purposeful. But the eyes stopped my thinking entirely. I'd worked around deep-sea predators before. 6-gill sharks, giant squid, the occasional wandering sperm whale. Their eyes were black voids adapted for perpetual darkness. functional but empty of anything I'd recognize as awareness. Dead spaces that reflected light without processing meaning. This creature's eyes tracked my submersible with unmistakable intelligence. They were enormous, each one larger than my helmet visor, and they held depth I'd never seen in marine life. Not the simple predator calculation of threat assessment or prey identification. Something more complex. Something that understood exactly what my submersible represented and why I was here. The creature maintained distance but followed my movements with precision. When I adjusted my position to get a better view, it shifted accordingly. When I panned the cameras, those massive eyes tracked the light sources. It was studying me as intently as I was studying it. My hands shook as I reached for the emergency transmission controls. Surface control, this is Deep 6. My voice came out steadier than I'd expected. I need immediate priority transmission. Emergency documentation. Deep 6, surface control, go ahead. Kate's voice carried the slight distortion of the deep water communication link. Transmitting live video feed now. External camera 3. I need confirmation on what you're seeing down here. I switched the primary feed to the camera tracking the creature and initiated emergency documentation protocol. The high-resolution video stream would take several minutes to reach the surface through the communication relay. But Kate needed to see this. Command needed to see this. Someone with more authority than a cable repair technician needed to make decisions about what happened next. The creature had stopped moving. It hovered 20 meters away, maintaining position in the water column with minimal effort. The bioluminescent patterns along its skeleton pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, almost like breathing or thinking. Deep 6, what exactly am I looking at here? Kate's voice carried new tension. This footage, is this equipment malfunction? Some kind of optical distortion? I opened my mouth to respond, but the creature moved before I could form words. It turned away from my submersible with deliberate precision and glided toward another cable bundle 50 meters away. Not the random movement of a curious predator investigating unfamiliar objects. This was targeted. The creature had identified specific infrastructure and moved to engage it. I watched it position itself above the cable housing with mechanical accuracy. The creature's jaw opened, revealing rows of teeth unlike anything in my marine biology reference guides. They weren't the cutting triangles of a shark or the gripping hooks of a squid. These were tools, precisely shaped for gripping and severing specific materials. The creature clamped down on the cable housing and began working with methodical efficiency. The protective sheathing parted under pressure I couldn't calculate. Fiber optic bundles separated with clean cuts that spoke to understanding of the infrastructure's construction. This wasn't feeding behavior. This wasn't territorial aggression. This was systematic destruction, performed by something that knew exactly what it was destroying and why. I watched the creature work and understood with horrible clarity that everything I'd attributed to equipment failure or natural predation had been deliberate sabotage. The scratches weren't random damage. They were reconnaissance marks. Test cuts to determine material composition and structural weak points. The patterns I documented weren't territory markers. They were work plans. This creature was systematically destroying communication infrastructure at depths where visual confirmation was impossible, where human observers couldn't document the deliberate nature of the sabotage, where corporate analysis would classify the damage as natural phenomena and schedule routine repairs that would fail again within months. The thing finished with the cable bundle and turned those intelligent eyes back toward my submersible, studying my reaction, measuring my response to what I'd witnessed. I understood then that I was looking at something that had been conducting an underwater war against human technology for longer than anyone suspected. something smart enough to target critical infrastructure while maintaining plausible deniability. Something that had just revealed itself to me for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend. Eugene's voice crackled through the comm system 20 minutes later. "Jerome, I've got those historical records Dr. Sharp requested." I kept my eyes on the creature circling outside. It hadn't moved closer, but it hadn't backed off either. Just that steady, deliberate patrol pattern around my position. "Go ahead." "Pulling data on unexplained internet outages worldwide, past 18 months. The sound of fingers on keyboards came through the speaker. "Starting with major trunk lines, subsea cable failures, satellite communication disruptions." My hand stayed steady on the controls, but something cold settled in my stomach. "What kind of pattern are you seeing?" "Hang on." More typing. Then silence that stretched too long. Jesus Christ. "Eugene?" "Jerome, this doesn't make sense." His voice had lost that professional calm. 17 major outages in the past year and a half. Pacific, Atlantic, Indian Ocean. Every single one blamed on equipment failure, seismic activity, or fishing vessel interference. The creature completed another circuit. 40 feet out, same depth, same speed. Watching. And the locations match your creature's territory exactly. My breath caught. I'd been thinking about cable damage, about repair costs and insurance claims, but Eugene was talking about something bigger. Global infrastructure, communications networks that connected continents. "Run those coordinates again." "Already did. 3 times. Eugene's voice carried the weight of someone who'd just connected dots he wished he hadn't. "Mariana Trench region, Puerto Rico Trench, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Aleutian Trench. Every major deep-water cable route where we've had unexplained failures." The pressure readings held steady, 23,700 feet. The creature maintained its distance, but I could see those massive eyes tracking my movements. Not hunting behavior, something more deliberate. "Eugene, how many people lost internet service during those outages?" Calculating. A pause. "Cumulative?" "Around 200 million users affected. Some outages lasted days before repair crews could reach the damaged sections." 200 million people. Financial markets disrupted. Emergency services compromised. Military communications severed. And every incident blamed on random mechanical failure or natural phenomena. I thought about the systematic damage I'd documented. The precise cuts through cable housing. The way the creature had appeared exactly when I'd reached the repair zone. Not coincidence. Strategy. "We're not looking at equipment failures," I said. "We're looking at warfare." The realization hit like decompression sickness. Sharp pain behind my eyes, nausea climbing my throat. This thing hadn't been randomly attacking cables for food or territorial reasons. It had been systematically targeting human infrastructure, cutting communications between continents, testing response times, learning our repair protocols, and it was smart enough to make each attack look like an accident. "Dr. Sharp needs to hear this," Eugene said. "Patch her in." Kate's voice came through crisp and professional. "Jerome, Eugene's briefing me on the historical data. What's your current status?" I watched the creature bank into another turn. "Still being observed. But Kate, this changes everything. We're not dealing with animal behavior. This is intelligence, deliberate targeting of critical infrastructure." "That's a significant leap." The submersible lurched sideways. Hard. My head slammed against the padded restraint. Warning lights erupted across the control panel like Christmas decorations from hell. The hull groaned with a sound I'd never heard before. Metal under stress that shouldn't be possible at this depth. Impact! I shouted into the comm. Taking impacts. The creature had moved, no longer circling. It was testing the hull integrity with controlled strikes, precise hits against structural weak points. Not random aggression. Calculated assessment. Another impact. The submersible spun 40 degrees before the stabilizers kicked in. My coffee mug launched across the cabin and shattered against the viewport frame. Red lights flooded the interior. Pressure alarms. Hull stress indicators climbing past yellow into orange territory. The titanium shell could handle pressure from water, but not direct impact from something with that much mass moving at speed. I keyed the comm with shaking fingers. Surface. I'm taking deliberate impacts. Repeat, deliberate impacts. This is not defensive behavior. Kate's voice came back tight with tension. Jerome, status report. Hull integrity? My eyes swept the panel. Oxygen reserves showed 4 hours and 12 minutes. Life support systems green, but the hull stress indicators kept climbing with each impact. 4 hours oxygen remaining. Hull showing stress fractures on the port side. If this continues... I didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Eugene's voice cut through the static. Jerome, can you evade? Negative. It's faster than me down here, more maneuverable. Another strike rocked the submersible. The lights flickered. And it knows exactly what it's doing. The creature was testing breaking points. Each impact targeted a different section of the hull, learning which areas showed the most stress. Methodical, scientific, like it had done this before. I stared at the oxygen gauge. 4 hours. At normal ascent rate, I needed 6 hours minimum to reach the surface safely. Emergency ascent would get me up in 90 minutes, but the decompression would probably kill me. Nitrogen bubbles in my bloodstream. Joints swelling until bones cracked. Brain hemorrhaging. But staying meant certain death when the hull breached. The math was simple and terrifying. Die fast from decompression sickness, or die slow from drowning at crushing depth. Another impact. This time I heard something crack. Jerome, you need to surface. Now. Kate's voice carried command authority. Emergency ascent protocols. Kate, emergency ascent from this depth. I know the risks, but that hull won't survive much more. The creature struck again. Port side, same location as the previous hit. The crack spread across my field of vision like lightning frozen in titanium. My hand moved to the ballast controls before my brain finished processing the decision. 12 years of deep water operations. I knew what emergency ascent meant. Knew the statistics on decompression survival from this depth. But I also knew what happened when pressure hulls failed. I keyed the comm one last time. Surface, emergency ascent. Blowing ballast tanks. Copy emergency ascent. Medical team standing by. I hit the ballast release. The submersible shot upward like a bullet fired from the ocean floor. G-force pressed me into the seat as we rocketed through black water at a rate that would have been exhilarating under any other circumstances. 23,000 feet. 22. 21. Through the rear cameras, I watched the creature pursue. Massive form keeping pace effortlessly for the first 800 feet. Then it slowed. Stopped. Hung motionless in the water column as I continued climbing toward the surface. It had tested the submersible's limits, learned what it needed to know. And now it was letting me go. The ascent continued. 18,000 feet. 15. 12. My joints started aching at 8,000 feet. Sharp pains in my knees and elbows. The nitrogen in my bloodstream forming bubbles as pressure decreased too rapidly. By 6,000 feet, I couldn't feel my fingers. By 3,000 feet, the pain had spread to my spine. I broke the surface unconscious. The decompression chamber on the research vessel barely saved my life. 48 hours of hyperbaric treatment to force the nitrogen bubbles back into solution. Another week before I could walk without assistance. But I was alive. And somewhere 23,000 feet below, something intelligent was planning its next move in a war we'd only just realized was happening. The first thing they told me was that I'd never work at depth again. Dr. Martinez delivered that news on day 4, when the nitrogen bubbles had finally cleared enough from my bloodstream for them to run proper tests. My left eye kept going in and out of focus, like someone was adjusting a broken lens. The joint damage in my fingers meant I couldn't make a proper fist anymore. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, checking my reflexes with that little rubber hammer. "Most people who ascend that fast from 23,000 feet don't make it to the surface." Lucky. Right. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted the water stains, 47 of them in various shades of brown. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and whatever they used to clean the floors. My fingers throbbed every time I tried to bend them. The left eye kept blurring whenever I looked at anything closer than 10 feet away. 3 days later, they moved me to a private room. Better view, they said. What they meant was fewer people around to ask questions. That's when David Rose showed up. I'd seen him around the company offices, but never worked with him directly. 6'2", gray hair cut military short, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. He walked into my room like he owned it, which technically he did. "Jerome." He pulled up the visitor chair and sat down without being invited. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got run over by a freight train." "The doctors say you'll make a full recovery. Mostly." I turned my head to look at him properly. The left eye made everything slightly double. "What do you want, David?" He opened a briefcase and pulled out a tablet, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward me. My own face stared back, grainy and washed out from the submersible's interior camera. The timestamp read 3 weeks ago. "This is from your ascent. Emergency protocols recorded everything." I watched myself fumbling with the ballast controls, heard my own voice calling for emergency surface. The panic was obvious even through the static. Then the screen went black. "That's all there is," David said. "Equipment malfunction at depth. Emergency ascent. Standard protocol." "What about the external camera footage?" "Corrupted during the ascent. Saltwater infiltration damaged the storage unit." He closed the tablet and leaned back in his chair. "Unfortunate. But these things happen." I knew what I'd transmitted. Hours of footage showing that creature circling the cable, those deliberate cuts, the intelligence behind every movement. They'd received it all before my ascent began. "What about Dr. Sharp's analysis? The pattern recognition data?" Dr. Sharp's preliminary assessment indicated possible seismic activity affecting cable integrity. Her final report will reflect that conclusion. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a discussion. David pulled out a folder and set it on the bedside table. "Your medical leave paperwork. Full pay for 6 months while you recover. After that, we'll find you something appropriate in surface operations. Quality control, maybe. Training new operators. A desk job. Safe and quiet and nowhere near the deep ocean. And if I don't want surface work? Then you'll find the job market quite challenging." He stood up and straightened his tie. "Jerome, you survived something that should have killed you. You have a chance at a normal life. I suggest you take it." He was almost to the door when I called after him. "What about the other sites?" David stopped but didn't turn around. "Other sites?" "The damage patterns. Eugene found 7 separate locations with similar characteristics. What happens to those cables?" Seismic activity is unpredictable. We'll monitor the situation and respond as needed. And if more cables fail, then we'll repair them, just like we always have. He left without looking back. The folder contained exactly what he'd promised: medical leave forms, disability assessment paperwork, and a confidentiality agreement that ran to 12 pages of legal language. The key phrase appeared on page 7. Discussion of classified operational details with unauthorized personnel constitutes a federal offense punishable by up to 20 years imprisonment. I signed it 3 days later. What choice did I have? The physical therapy started in week 2. Basic stuff at first, trying to bend my fingers without wincing, reading eye charts with my damaged vision. The therapist was a cheerful woman named Linda, who kept telling me how well I was doing. Progress was progress, she said. Even small improvements mattered. She was right about that, I guess. By the end of the 2nd week, I could hold a coffee cup without dropping it. The double vision in my left eye came and went instead of staying constant. Walking up a flight of stairs didn't leave me gasping like I'd run a marathon. But every night, I lay awake thinking about what was still down there. Eugene stopped by during week 3, brought coffee and donuts from that place near the harbor we used to hit after long shifts. He looked uncomfortable, kept checking his phone like he expected someone to call. "How you holding up?" he asked. "Been better, been worse." We talked about surface stuff for a while. Weather, sports, his kid's soccer season. Normal conversation between two guys who'd worked together for years. But there was something careful about the way he chose his words. Finally, he got to the real reason for his visit. "They transferred me," he said. "Atlantic operations. Leaving next week." "Promotion?" "Lateral move. Same pay grade, different responsibilities." Which meant they'd moved everyone who'd been involved in the operation. Scattered the team, eliminated any chance of unofficial discussions about what we'd found. Eugene finished his coffee and checked his phone again. "Jerome, you know I can't." "I know. But if there was something to know, you'd want to know it was still happening, right?" I met his eyes. Still happening. Hypothetically. If there were ongoing infrastructure issues at multiple sites, if repair schedules were being accelerated and damage assessments were coming back with similar characteristics, if someone wanted to keep track of such things, the maritime incident reports would be filed under geological survey data. He stood up and gathered the empty coffee cups. "Good talking with you, Jerome. Take care of yourself." After he left, I used the hospital's public computer to access the maritime database. Took me 3 hours to navigate their filing system, but Eugene had pointed me in the right direction. 7 incidents in the past 2 weeks. Cable damage at depths exceeding 20,000 feet. All attributed to seismic activity. All requiring emergency repair operations. The same methodical pattern I'd witnessed firsthand was continuing across the entire North Atlantic grid. By week 4, I was walking without assistance and reading normal-sized text with my right eye. The left one would never be perfect, but it was functional. My fingers had regained most of their mobility, though cold weather still made the joints ache like hell. Dr. Martinez signed my discharge papers on a Tuesday morning. "Remember what we discussed about depth restrictions," she said. "Your body can't handle that kind of pressure differential anymore. One more incident like this and the damage will be permanent." I nodded and shook her hand with my good eye focused on her face. Understood. The cab ride home took 40 minutes through morning traffic. I watched the harbor through the window, saw the research vessels and cable repair ships preparing for their next deployments. Somewhere out there, teams were heading down to fix what that creature had destroyed, following the same protocols I'd followed for 12 years. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered. Mail stacked on the counter, plants dying from 3 weeks of neglect, everything covered in a thin layer of dust. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking through the newspaper's job listings. Surface work, mostly. Harbor operations, equipment maintenance, training positions. Nothing that would get me anywhere near 20,000 feet of water. I spent the next 2 weeks learning how to live with the damage. The joint stiffness was worst in the mornings. Took a hot shower and 20 minutes of careful stretching before I could grip things properly. The vision problems meant reading anything for more than an hour gave me headaches. Simple tasks like threading a needle or reading small print became exercises in frustration. But I was alive, and I knew what was down there. The maritime incident reports kept updating. Every few days, another cable failure at depth. Emergency repair operations dispatched to locations scattered across the Atlantic basin. The damage descriptions all followed the same pattern: precise cuts through protective housing, targeting critical junction points, occurring at depths where conventional sabotage was impossible. Seismic activity, according to every official report. I started mapping the incidents on a chart I kept taped to my kitchen wall. Red pins for confirmed failures, yellow for repair operations in progress. The pattern emerged clearly once you plotted enough data points. A systematic progression along major communication routes, targeting the most critical infrastructure nodes. Whatever was down there wasn't just randomly destroying cables. It was conducting a methodical campaign against the backbone of global communications, and it was smart enough to make each incident look like a natural disaster. 3 months after my emergency ascent, I was officially transferred to surface operations. Quality control inspector for incoming cable shipments. I spent my days checking manifests and testing connector assemblies in a warehouse that smelled like machine oil and rubber gaskets. Safe work, predictable work. The kind of job where the biggest risk was a paper cut or a strained back from lifting cable reels. But every night, I went home and updated my map. Red pins multiplying across the Atlantic grid. Repair schedules accelerating as damage rates increased. Insurance claims mounting as companies struggled to maintain connectivity across increasingly unreliable deep-sea links. The creature was winning its war, one cable at a time. And the only people who knew the truth were either sworn to silence or scattered across different assignments, unable to compare notes or share observations. David Rose had done his job well. The evidence was buried, the witnesses neutralized, the official narrative established. I sat in my kitchen on a cold December evening, looking at the map I'd been building for 8 months. 67 confirmed incidents. Hundreds of millions in repair costs. Communication delays affecting financial markets, research operations, military coordination. All attributed to increased seismic activity in the deep Atlantic. My left eye ached from the cold, and my fingers were stiff enough that I fumbled with the coffee cup. Permanent reminders of the 30 seconds I'd spent face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Something intelligent enough to target human civilization's most vulnerable infrastructure while maintaining perfect plausible deniability. It was still down there. Still circling those cables with deliberate purpose. Still carving its methodical path through the systems that kept our world connected. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it except sit here, healing slowly, watching the red pins multiply on my map while the creature continued its patient work 20,000 feet below the surface. The war was real. I'd seen it firsthand. But officially, it wasn't happening at all. The call came on a Tuesday morning exactly 4 weeks and 3 days after they'd pulled me out of the water more dead than alive. I was squinting through my left eye at the newspaper I couldn't quite read anymore. The vision problems hadn't gotten better like the doctors promised they would. Some days the words stayed still long enough for me to make sense of them. Other days, everything swam around like fish in a bowl. My phone rang at 8:17. I knew the time because I'd been staring at the clock on the stove, watching the minutes tick by until I could take my next round of pills. The pain in my joints had settled into a steady ache that the medication barely touched, but it was better than the lightning bolts that used to shoot through my fingers every time I moved them. Jerome Brown. Jerome, this is Dr. Sharp. I set down the coffee mug I'd been holding. Kate's voice sounded different over the phone, tighter, more controlled than usual. In person, she'd always been direct but not unfriendly. This was all business. Doctor, we have a situation. Of course they did. I looked out my kitchen window at the gray October sky and waited for her to tell me what I already knew was coming. Another cable severed. Same coordinates, same depth. 23,700 feet. The exact spot where I'd met that thing face to face. Where it had circled me for 20 minutes like it was deciding whether to crush my submersible or let me live. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the medication. When? Yesterday, at 1400 hours. Complete separation, just like before. Clean cuts through the armoring. No debris field. No equipment malfunction. She paused. Jerome, we've run diagnostics on every piece of hardware we've got. Stress analysis on the cable housing, metallurgical examination of the severed ends, environmental impact studies. Everything comes back normal. Everything except the fact that we've now lost 2 major communication lines at the exact same location. I rubbed my left temple where the headaches like to start. What about the other technicians? You've got plenty of people certified for deep water repairs. That's just it. Her voice got quieter, like she was making sure nobody else could hear. We've sent 3 different teams down there over the past month. Routine maintenance checks, sediment surveys, equipment testing. Standard protocol after a major incident. And? Nothing. No contact, no sightings, no anomalous readings. Whatever you encountered down there, Jerome, it's not showing itself to anyone else. The cold in my stomach spread outward. I thought about those intelligent eyes studying me through the submersible's viewport. The way the creature had moved, not like a predator hunting, but like something conducting an examination, testing me, learning from me. You think it's waiting for me specifically. I think whatever damaged that cable the first time has done it again for a reason. Kate's words came out measured and careful. And I think you're the only person who's seen what we're really dealing with down there. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. My reflection stared back at me, 38 years old and looking 50, with the kind of worn-down appearance that came from breathing recycled air and living under pressure for too long. What are you asking me, Kate? I'm asking you to go back down there. She said it like she was asking me to pick up groceries. Simple. Matter of fact. Like we both knew there wasn't really any choice in the matter. The decompression nearly killed me. You saw the medical reports. I did. I also saw what you documented down there. The systematic damage patterns, the behavioral observations, the evidence of intelligence. No one else has been able to gather that kind of information. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and watched a neighbor walking his dog down the street. Normal people doing normal things. What's the company offering? Triple hazard pay. Experimental pressure suits designed specifically for extended deep water operations. Full medical support team standing by topside. Whatever equipment you need. Triple hazard pay meant they were scared. Really scared. The experimental suits meant they were admitting the standard gear wasn't sufficient for whatever was down there. The medical team meant they expected me to come back damaged again. Or not come back at all. Jerome? Kate's voice pulled me back to the conversation. There's something else you need to know. What? The severed cable wasn't discovered during routine monitoring. We found it because fishing vessels started reporting communication blackouts in a grid pattern extending outward from the damage site. Whatever cut that cable knew exactly which one to target for maximum impact. My reflection in the window seemed to blur and sharpen as my left eye struggled to focus. The creature hadn't just damaged infrastructure. It had studied the network, identified critical nodes, calculated the effects of specific cuts. It was conducting warfare. And now it had severed another cable in the exact spot where it had first made contact with me. It wants me to come back down there. That's what I think too. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine descending through that black water again. The pressure building with every foot of depth. The moment when my lights would pick up movement in the darkness, and I'd know I wasn't alone. The creature circling my submersible while I sat helpless inside a titanium shell, completely at its mercy. My hands started shaking, not from the joint damage this time, but from something deeper. Fear mixed with a recognition I didn't want to acknowledge. Part of me wanted to go back down there. Part of me needed to understand what I'd seen. What about Rose? What about the classification protocols? Kate was quiet for a long moment. David Rose has made his position very clear. Any evidence of anomalous contact will be classified immediately. Any personnel who discuss the mission outside authorized channels will face federal prosecution. The official record will show routine cable repair and maintenance. So nothing had changed. I'd go down there, document whatever I found, watch them bury the evidence, and keep my mouth shut about it or go to prison. Just like before. Except this time I knew what was waiting for me in the depths. I knew it was intelligent. I knew it was planning something. I opened my eyes and stared at my reflection in the window glass. The creature had severed that cable specifically to bring me back down. It had waited exactly 1 month, long enough for me to recover enough to make the descent. Not long enough for me to forget what I'd seen. It was calling me back to finish whatever conversation we'd started. I weighed all of it while Kate waited on the other end of the line, and my neighbor disappeared around the corner with his dog, leaving the street empty and quiet. "Yeah," I said into the phone. "I'll take it." The words came out before I'd finished weighing everything, before I'd counted up all the reasons to say no. Kate went quiet on the other end. Probably hadn't expected me to decide that fast. But the choice had been made the moment she'd mentioned those coordinates. 23,000 feet in the Mariana Trench, the exact spot where they'd pulled me up 4 weeks ago with nitrogen bubbles in my blood and my left eye going fuzzy. Where I'd watched that translucent nightmare circle my submersible like it was deciding whether to let me live. It wasn't coincidence that the cable had severed there again. "Jerome, you understand what you're agreeing to?" Kate's voice carried that careful tone she used when she thought I was making decisions with my gut instead of my brain. The depth, the experimental equipment. "I understand." I shifted the phone to my other ear and looked out at the empty street. Mrs. Chen was watering her roses across the way, moving slow and methodical like she had all day. Normal people doing normal things while I agreed to drop 4 miles into the ocean to meet something that shouldn't exist. The creature wanted me back. Had to be that. You don't get equipment failures at the exact same coordinates by accident. Not at those depths. Not with those precision targeting systems. It had cut the cable knowing someone would have to come down and fix it. Knowing they'd send me. Smart enough to understand human psychology. Smart enough to know I was the only one who'd seen it and lived. Smart enough to bet that I'd come back. The transport leaves from San Diego in 6 hours, Kate said. "Can you make it?" I was already reaching for my go bag in the hall closet. "I'll be there." The experimental pressure suits were waiting when I got to the dock. Dr. Sharp stood next to them in the equipment bay, clipboard in hand, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The suits hung from their frames like empty shells. Titanium and ceramic composite with joints that moved like liquid mercury. "These are prototypes," she said when I walked up. "Field tested twice, both times successful, but they haven't been down to 23,000 feet. No." I ran my fingers along the suit's chest plate. The material felt warm under my palm, some kind of thermal regulation built into the composite. The helmet looked like something from a science fiction movie, transparent aluminum with HUD displays projected on the inside surface. "What's the crush depth?" "Theoretical maximum is 28,000 feet. But Jerome..." She set down her clipboard and looked at me straight on. "These aren't production models. We're asking you to beta test experimental equipment at the bottom of the ocean." The support crew was setting up behind us. Eugene running communications checks, Dr. Yang reviewing the biological survey protocols, David Rose talking into his phone about security classifications. All of them pretending this was routine salvage work instead of what it really was, a return visit to something that had been planning this moment since the day they'd hauled me up. I thought about the creature while the crew prepped the descent platform, about the way it had moved through the water like it belonged there, like the crushing pressure was nothing more than a light breeze, about the bioluminescent skeleton I'd seen pulsing beneath translucent skin, casting that blue-white glow across the trench floor, about the intelligence behind those movements, the way it had studied my submersible, circling at just the right distance to stay visible but not threatening. Not yet threatening. It could have crushed me in an instant if it had wanted to. Instead, it had let me watch. Let me see what it was doing to our infrastructure. Like it was sending a message. The experimental suit's joints clicked softly as the technicians ran their final checks. Each piece of equipment represented millions of dollars in research and development, all of it designed to keep one person alive in an environment that wanted to kill them in a dozen different ways. Triple hazard pay. That's what Kate had offered, and I'd taken it without asking for the number. Didn't matter how much they were paying. There wasn't enough money in the world to make this assignment reasonable. But reasonable had stopped being an option the moment I'd seen those scratches on the cable housing, the moment I'd realized something down there was systematically targeting our deep-sea infrastructure while maintaining perfect plausible deniability. A war nobody wanted to admit was happening. My left eye twitched as I watched the crew work. The vision problems hadn't gotten better like the doctors had promised. Still went fuzzy without warning. Still made reading a challenge on bad days. The joint damage in my fingers was permanent too. They ached when the weather changed, reminded me every morning that I'd pushed human physiology past its limits and paid the price. Going down again would make everything worse. The decompression, the pressure stress, the simple fact of spending hours at depths where human beings had no business being alive. Dr. Martinez had been clear about that when he'd delivered my medical clearance with all the enthusiasm of a man signing a death certificate. "You do this again," he'd said, "and I can't guarantee you'll come back up in one piece." I'd signed the waiver anyway. Eugene looked up from his communications panel. "All systems green, Jerome. Descent platforms ready when you are." Dr. Yang was reviewing her biological monitoring equipment, checking sensors that would record everything we encountered on the way down. Looking for signs of the creature that officially didn't exist, that would never exist in any report that saw daylight. David Rose finished his phone call and walked over. "Remember, anything you observe down there stays classified. The cable repair is your only mission objective. But we all knew that wasn't true. The cable repair was just an excuse to get me back down there, to see if the creature would show itself again, to confirm what we already suspected about the systematic nature of the infrastructure damage, to find out what it wanted. The descent platform hummed with quiet efficiency as the crew made their final preparations. I'd be riding it down 4 miles through absolute darkness, past the point where sunlight disappeared forever, past the point where the water pressure could crush steel like paper, back to where something waited that had learned to use our own infrastructure against us, something that had been patient enough to wait 4 weeks for me to heal, patient enough to cut another cable at the exact coordinates where we'd first met. I sealed my gear bag and looked out at the ocean. The water stretched to the horizon, dark blue under the afternoon sun. Peaceful. Gave no hint of what moved in the depths below, of the intelligence that had been studying us while we pretended it didn't exist. The creature was waiting. 23,000 feet down, in the darkness where no human being should be able to survive. Waiting for me to come back, so it could continue whatever conversation we'd started during that first encounter. I'd made my choice. Accepted the triple hazard pay, signed the waivers, agreed to test experimental equipment in conditions that might kill me even if everything went perfectly. The official reports would classify everything again. Whatever I saw down there would disappear into files that nobody would ever read. The creature would remain a theory, a possibility, something that might explain the infrastructure damage if anyone was brave enough to consider alternatives to equipment failure. But I knew the truth. Had seen it circling in the darkness, had watched it study me with intelligence that shouldn't exist at those depths. It was waiting for me to come back. Had been waiting since the moment they'd pulled me up. Patient, calculating, ready to continue the war it was fighting in the deepest places of the ocean. And despite everything, the damaged joints, the compromised vision, the certainty that I was descending into something that wanted to reshape the rules of engagement between species, I was going back down. The platform was ready. The experimental suit hung waiting. The crew stood by their stations, professional and calm despite knowing they were sending me to meet something that officially didn't exist. I was going back to 23,000 feet, back to where the creature waged its silent war against human civilization, back to discover what it wanted from the only person who'd seen it and lived to tell about it, even if nobody would ever be allowed to listen.